This week in October marks OCD Awareness Week. Now, I spoke to the president of OCD Twin Cities to learn more about the disorder, the myths surrounding the condition, and the treatment that helps those living with obsessive-compulsive disorder. We do have a warning here. Some of the content in this interview may be difficult for some people to hear.
Thank you for joining me today. It is OCD Awareness Week, and I really wanted to talk with someone who's an expert. You are an OCD researcher and a counselor who specializes in OCD treatment, plus you're the president of OCD Twin Cities. So tell me a little bit about the work you do.
As president of OCD Twin Cities, my primary task is raising awareness and facilitating treatment of OCD. And one of the reasons that's so important is OCD is a really misunderstood mental disorder. A lot of times when people think of OCD, they might think of it as, oh, that person's so OCD. They like things straight or organized, or maybe they wash their hands a little bit more than normal. But that's not really what OCD is. OCD is oftentimes a really severe mental disorder, and it's one of the leading causes of disability in the world. So it's really not a minor feature of someone's experience when it shows up, and it's characterized by obsessions, which are unwanted thoughts that come into a person's mind, and they get stuck. The person can't make them go away, and it causes a lot of distress. They become really, really anxious. A very common OCD theme area is what we call hit and run OCD. And in this theme area, and when I say theme area, Maria, what I mean is for people with OCD, they can have all kinds of obsessions that really concern them, but a lot of times they'll kind of get stuck on a handful of them that really take up most of their time. In hit and run OCD, the obsession is, oh my goodness, did I hit someone with my car and not realize it, and then I just drove away? And when they start getting stuck with that thought, when they're driving their car and they drive by a pedestrian or they hit a bump in the road, that thought clicks in, and it makes them very, very anxious because they are concerned, maybe I caused harm to someone. And so what they do to try and make themselves feel less anxious and make that obsession go away is they'll circle around and drive back where they've been so they can verify there's someone not laying in the middle of the road. And sometimes they can get stuck in these driving loops for hours. And so you can imagine it's really exhausting. And so that obsession makes them anxious, and then they start to do all sorts of compulsions, which are designed to neutralize the thought and make them feel better. So, for example, if their fear is, what if I inexplicably yell a racial slur? One compulsion that they might do is they might bite their tongue all the time when they're around other people. And why do you think they might do that, Maria? What's the strategy of biting their tongue when they have that thought?
Just prevent them from speaking.
So if I'm working with someone whose theme area is, what if I just randomly start punching someone and then they collapse to the ground and then I jump on top of them and keep punching them? Why might they very, very rigidly keep their hands in their pockets anytime they're walking around other people?
Yeah, to prevent them from using them.
Exactly, because the idea is, well, if I really do keep my hands in my pockets, that'll act as a barrier to me actually doing this terrible thing. Inside of OCD, the main feature of obsessions are that they get stuck. It's a scary story that gets stuck. It really doesn't matter what the scary story is. Of course, it matters to the individual. When I was living with OCD, I had a number of different theme areas, but my biggest obsession was that I was going to die of rabies. In my case, the obsession was actually that I would be bit by a rabid animal, but not realize it, which sounds really far-fetched, but that is the thought that got stuck. And as a result, it got really hard for me to go outside. And eventually got really hard for me to be inside because I was always worried somehow a bat got into my house and maybe I didn't realize it, so on and so forth.
When it comes to the prevalence of people diagnosed with this disorder, What does that look like in the state of Minnesota?
Yeah. So if we had to estimate, of course we don't know the exact number, but probably right now in Minnesota, there's somewhere between 60,000, 75,000 people in Minnesota who have OCD. Um, and the vast majority of them are probably not getting appropriate treatment. We know that on average for adults, the amount of time it takes for them after the onset of their symptoms to receiving appropriate treatment is about 15 years. So, I mean, more a decade and a half before they actually are getting the form of interventions that are going to help. For kids, the picture's a little bit better. Usually, it'll be about 2.5 years before a child sees a mental health professional. And then often it's another year, year and a half before they actually get to a mental health professional who's going to be able to help with the OCD. So, of course, that's why we're trying to raise awareness because OCD is so painful to live with. And we don't want OCD sufferers having to go through that process, usually on their own for 15 years.
Okay, yes. So what does treatment generally, I suppose, look like?
What we typically think of as the gold standard for OCD treatment is what we call exposure and response prevention treatment. Now, what happens, Maria, in ERP treatment is we support and guide individuals with OCD in confronting those situations that really scare them. So, so they can get practice being with the thoughts and feelings in those situations. And instead of trying to make them go away, which is what people with OCD spend lots of time doing, we just let the thoughts and the feelings be there. So an example might be if I'm working with someone who had a harm related theme area, what if I stab my child with a knife if they're in the kitchen with me? As we go through the process of ERP, we'll work our way up a set of exposures that get gradually more scary for them. So initially, it might be just getting all the knives out of the locked trunk in the car, which they keep them there as part of their safety behaviors, and just putting them back in the kitchen. But eventually, it might get up to the point where their exposure is I'm going to chop these carrots in the kitchen while my kid is sitting at the kitchen island with me. And if that thought of stabbing my kid comes to my mind, I'm just going to let it be there. And if it makes me feel really anxious, I'm just going to let that anxious feeling be there. And I'm not going to do anything to try and make those thoughts and feelings go away. I'm not going to put the knife away. I'm not going to repeat some sort of magical phrase in my mind that's supposed to keep me from doing that. And we get them eventually, after enough practice, to a point where I can be in the kitchen chopping vegetables. And I might even notice the thought, like, oh, what if I stab my kid? But it doesn't really bug me anymore because I know it's just a thought.
How long does something like that take?
Well, it really varies. So it's very individual. What we know is that from our randomized control trials, we typically see a durable and substantial response, meaning a reduction in their OCD symptoms, after somewhere between 60 to 100 exposure practices. And exposure is typically, 45 minutes to an hour.
So I'm curious, can people have multiple obsessions and conditions?
Yeah. That's the norm is that people have multiple obsessions. Now, usually, a one, two, three, a handful of those theme areas will be the prominent ones. So most people go into treatment and they really are focused in on this obsession or that obsession, but all the time they have a number of different obsessions, and it's not that uncommon for an obsession to sort of jump. So, for instance, when my OCD started in 2007, my primary obsession was that I was going to contract HIV from the environment. And I had spent thousands of dollars consulting with doctors, and they told me, oh, yeah, that's not really something that can happen, but the obsession just stuck around anyways. And I had that obsession as my primary theme area for 4 years when randomly in 2011, it just all of a sudden switched to this fear of contracting rabies from the environment. And I still was kind of afraid of contracting HIV, but it basically just disappeared. It was no longer at the top of my list of concerns, and that can happen.
Is there a certain demographic of people or a certain type of person that is more likely to have OCD?
OCD does not know any boundaries, gender boundaries or racial boundaries. It can pop up for anyone. But one thing that we do know is it is going to be more common in families for a variety of different reasons. So that's something to be on the lookout for. And one thing that can be really helpful to keep in mind is not always, but OCD usually shows up in two age windows. So that first window is in kind of the 7 to 12 range. And the second window is like around 20. So that's when we usually see it starting to show up. Now, again, it's not like if someone is 15 and they start noticing symptoms of OCD, they say, oh, well, that's not in the OCD window, so it can't be OCD. Check in with a professional. But that can be something that's helpful to keep in mind, is that it usually does pop up in those windows.
If you want more information about obsessive-compulsive disorder or how to get treatment, you can visit OCDTwinCities.org or their parent organization, the International OCD Foundation, by going to IOCDF.org.